It was a crisp morning in early 1992 as Gary Subrick drove down the highway towards Long Island, New York. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm, golden hue over the empty road ahead. Today was his wedding day, and Stephen felt a mixture of nervous anticipation and joy bubbling up inside him. He could barely keep his focus, his mind racing with excitement about the ceremony, the vows, and seeing his bride in her dress. He glanced briefly at his rearview mirror, only to do a double-take when he spotted a car speeding up behind him. It was a familiar car, a dark green sedan he knew all too well. A shiver of unease trickled down his spine as he realized it was his brother Gary's car. Stephen's heart skipped a beat. Gary wasn't supposed to be here. He lived in Texas and had told Stephen he'd be flying in for the wedding. Confused but curious, Stephen slowed down slightly, allowing the car to pull up alongside him. As the sedan matched his speed, he turned his head and saw Gary sitting in the driver's seat, alone. His brother was staring directly at him, not at the road. The look on Gary's face wasn't one of recognition or joy. It was blank, almost lifeless. A strange smile began to stretch across Gary's lips, but it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was twisted, almost mocking, as if he were enjoying some private joke that Stephen wasn't in on. Stephen raised his hand and waved at his brother, attempting to brush off the creeping discomfort he felt. Gary didn't wave back. Instead, he began making bizarre faces, contorting his features in a way that was unlike him. Wide eyes, exaggerated grimaces, almost as if he were trying to stretch his skin. Stephen frowned, glancing back at the road, then quickly back to Gary. But just as suddenly as it began, Gary's car accelerated, speeding off ahead at an alarming rate, disappearing into the horizon. Stephen, now alone on the road, felt a chill run through him. He tried to laugh it off, thinking it was some strange joke, but a gnawing feeling of dread settled deep in his gut. Something wasn't right. Stephen arrived at the wedding venue, still feeling uneasy after the encounter on the highway. The day continued as planned, filled with laughter, celebration, and the joyous chatter of family and friends. Yet, in the back of his mind, Stephen couldn't shake the image of his brother's twisted smile and blank stare. As the evening settled in, Stephen finally found a moment to pull Gary aside. He couldn't help but ask, half-jokingly, "What was that about earlier? You really gave me a scare on the road." Making those faces, he expected Gary to laugh and brush it off as a prank. Instead, Gary's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Gary furrowed his brow, tilting his head slightly. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tinged with genuine bewilderment. Stephen felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to clarify, recounting how Gary's car had pulled up alongside him, how he had seen his brother's face clearly through the window. But Gary simply shook his head, insisting he had flown in from Texas the night before and hadn't driven any car since his arrival. The disbelief in Gary's eyes was unsettling, as if Stephen were telling him a story from a strange dream. "You must have mistaken someone else's car for mine," Gary insisted, but Stephen knew what he saw. The doubt etched on his brother's face only deepened the sense of dread gnawing at him. Feeling frustrated and slightly embarrassed, Stephen decided to drop the subject, forcing a smile as he tried to convince himself it was just a misunderstanding. But as they rejoined the crowd, a sense of unease lingered. He glanced across the room, spotting the rest of his family mingling, laughing, oblivious to the strange encounter he had experienced. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the ominous feeling. Yet, deep down, a voice whispered that something was very wrong. He couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see that twisted smile watching him from a distance. The wedding celebration continued late into the night, but Stephen couldn't shake the strange feeling that had taken hold of him. He tried to focus on the laughter and dancing around him, but every time he glanced at Gary, he felt a gnawing sense of discomfort. Something was off about his brother, something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the denial of their encounter on the road earlier. It was the way Gary seemed distant, almost like he was there physically, but his mind was elsewhere. Stephen caught himself staring, trying to find any sign, any clue that he had imagined the whole thing. But the memory of that twisted smile, the lifeless eyes staring back at him, felt too vivid to be a mere trick of his mind. Eventually, the noise of the party began to fade as the guests trickled out, leaving only close family and friends behind. Stephen took this moment to confront Gary again. This time, he was more insistent, almost pleading. "You were there, Gary. I saw you. Your car, your face. You were making those strange faces at me." Gary's expression hardened, the amusement gone from his eyes. He looked at Stephen with a mix of pity and confusion. "Stephen, I wasn't there. I flew in." "You know that," Gary said slowly, almost as if he were speaking to a child. His calm, measured tone only fueled Stephen's frustration. He felt a flash of anger rise inside him, a burning desire to make Gary admit what he had seen. Just as Stephen was about to press further, a loud noise broke through the quiet chatter of the remaining guests, a sharp, metallic clinking sound, like something being dropped. Both brothers turned toward the source, but nothing seemed out of place. The room fell silent for a brief moment, a palpable tension in the air. Stephen felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He looked at Gary, who seemed momentarily disoriented, his eyes unfocused. When their gazes met again, there was a flicker of something unsettling in Gary's eyes, almost as if he didn't recognize Stephen. The moment passed quickly, but it left Stephen with a deep, unshakable feeling of dread. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. He watched as Gary mingled with the last few guests, but there was an unsettling quality to his movements, almost robotic. Stephen tried to convince himself that he was just being paranoid, that the stress of the day was playing tricks on his mind. Yet, every time he caught a glimpse of Gary out of the corner of his eye, it felt like he was watching a stranger, someone wearing his brother's face but lacking his warmth and familiarity. He decided he couldn't let it go. He needed to confront Gary one last time before the night ended. Stephen approached Gary cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "Gary, this isn't funny anymore," Stephen said, his voice trembling. "I need you to tell me the truth. Did you meet me on the road earlier today?" Gary turned slowly, locking eyes with Stephen. For a moment, his face was expressionless, devoid of any recognizable emotion. Then, a smile crept across his lips, but it wasn't the friendly, familiar grin Stephen knew. It was the same twisted smile he had seen on the highway. "Stephen," Gary finally replied, his voice low and almost mechanical, "I told you. I wasn't there." The words sent a shiver down Stephen's spine, but what made his blood run cold was the look in Gary's eyes. It was like he was staring right through him. Before Stephen could react, Gary took a step closer, leaning in as if to whisper a secret. "You're not supposed to see me yet," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the faint music still playing in the background. Stephen's breath hitched as he realized he wasn't talking to his brother anymore. This was someone or something else entirely. He stumbled back, his legs weak, as Gary's smile widened unnaturally, stretching beyond what seemed humanly possible. Then, without another word, Gary turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the now empty venue. Stephen stood there, frozen, his mind racing with terror and confusion. He knew, deep down, that the man he had spoken to wasn't his brother, and he feared what that meant.